Surprising sentiments. Senate Democrats honor Mother's Day by highlighting their support for abortion. We're on Capitol Hill. Groundbreaking new law. The Vatican announces an extensive set of rules to combat clergy sex abuse. It will involve every priest and religious sister around the world. A kicker and his return. We introduce you to the professional football player who came back to his faith and now tries to inspire others. And from Washington, D.C. to Rome, a Catholic choir from the nation's capital performed in the Eternal City. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, May 9th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining me from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Pope Francis has introduced a groundbreaking new church law addressing the clergy sex abuse crisis. It requires all Catholic priests and nuns worldwide to report to church authorities clergy sexual abuse or a cover-up of abuse by their superiors. The law was announced today at the Vatican. It provides whistleblower protections for anyone making a report and requires all dioceses around the world to have a system in place to receive the claims confidentially. But the law does not require them to report to police. We will have analysis of the new law later in the broadcast. North Korea launches missiles, Iran threatens the U.S., and China considers tariff retaliation. President Donald Trump is facing a series of issues around the world, and tonight we're following the international negotiations. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. North Korea fired more missiles today, days after testing its first rocket since 2017. It could signal the country isn't willing to dismantle its nuclear program, but President Trump has other concerns on his radar as well, including a new threat from Iran and trade talks with China.
Chinese government officials meet in Washington tonight with members of the Trump administration. Both sides negotiating to push a trade deal between the world's two largest economies across the finish line. President Trump says they were almost there.
We were getting very close to a deal, then they started to renegotiate the deal. We can't have that.
So effective tomorrow, the president plans to slap more fees on billions of dollars worth of Chinese imports to the U.S. Beijing has promised to retaliate. Will a tariff war continue or trade agreement be reached?
I did get last night a very beautiful letter from President Xi. Let's work together. Let's see if we can get something done.
Meanwhile, the president's correspondence with another world leader, North Korea's Kim Jong-un, may not be progressing as planned. Talks aimed at ending Kim's nuclear weapons program now disrupted by rockets. North Korea continues a week of missile tests, the first since President Trump and Chairman Kim began negotiating.
Nobody's happy about it, but we're taking a good look and we'll see. We'll see. The relationship continues.
And in the Middle East, American military on alert. Another country with nuclear weapons aspirations, Iran, giving the U.S. reason to send an aircraft carrier to the region.
We have information that you don't want to know about. They were very threatening, and we just want to have, we have to have great security for this country and for a lot of other places.
Now remember, President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal a year ago. This week, Iran vowed to continue enriching uranium, which could be developed for nuclear weapons if a new deal with other world leaders isn't reached. President Trump is encouraging Iranian officials to call him to work out a new agreement. Lauren.
White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thank you, Mark. The Senate Intelligence Committee has issued a subpoena to Donald Trump Jr. They want the president's son to answer questions about his testimony 2 years ago as part of its probe into interference by Russia in the 2016 election. It's the first known subpoena of a member of the president's family. Democratic senators hit the floor to talk about contraception and abortion. Healthcare is shaping up to be a key issue on the 2020 campaign trail, just as it was last fall. That's when exit polls revealed it was the most important issue for Americans as they cast their ballots. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi has more. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. 10 Senate Democrats honored Mother's Day. They linked it with women's health. They criticized the Trump administration and then defended Planned Parenthood.
Happy Mother's Day, early, from the Senate floor.
Mr. President, as we approach Mother's Day this upcoming Sunday, I'm gathered with many of my Senate colleagues to urge our Republican friends here in the Senate to reject many of the policies coming down from the Trump administration that put women's health and well-being at risk.
Maryland Democrat Chris Van Hollen takes aim at the Trump administration's new rules for federal family planning dollars. It stops that money from going to groups that perform or promote abortion.
A primary goal of this regulation, and there's been no secret about this, is to prevent federal funds from going to comprehensive family planning providers like Planned Parenthood.
Presidential counselor Kellyanne Conway on Capitol Hill says they're actually moving those dollars to other women's health centers.
But when we talk about women's health, we talk about a range of issues. When we talk about women's health, we're only talking about abortion. They ought to just say the word.
And 44 Democrats in February voted to sink the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act.
The motion is not agreed to.
It would require doctors and nurses treat babies surviving abortion and rush them to the hospital. The sponsor of the House's version updates me on her bill.
We're putting some pressure on districts that I believe colleagues would be supportive on the Democrat side of the aisle of making sure that children that are born alive are given life-saving care.
The GOP is gathering signatures to bypass the House Democratic blockade. If they reach 218, they can bring the Born Alive Act up for a vote. Now, they still need 19 more signatures. So far, only 3 Democrats have signed on. One Democrat says others may be holding off so as not to insult Speaker Pelosi. Lauren?
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. Lawmakers in Alabama delay a vote on a pro-life proposal after anger erupts on the Senate floor there.
Committee amendment is tabled. Senator Chambliss.
There was no motion. There was no motion.
There was a motion. He made a motion.
He didn't even make a motion, Mr. President.
The confrontation began after Republican senators stripped exceptions for rape and incest from a bill to ban most abortions. The proposal would also make it a felony to perform an abortion at any stage. Every Democrat and at least one Republican objected to the motion being quickly gavelled through. A judge in Virginia rules against state regulations forbidding first trimester abortions from being performed by non-doctors. Nearly 12 lawsuits in states across the country are seeking to allow nurse practitioners, midwives, and physician assistants to perform abortions. For more on this story, including the reaction of pro-life supporters, visit our partners at CatholicNewsAgency.com. Opposition lawmakers in Venezuela say they're not backing down in their battle to oust President Nicolas Maduro. Last night, security forces loyal to Maduro arrested the number 2 leader of the nation's opposition-led Congress. The regime is going after its political opponents, and they say they were part of an attempt coup to overthrow the president last week. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reports from the State Department.
Good evening, Lauren. State Department officials say Secretary Mike Pompeo is aware of the crackdown on political opponents. Today, he spoke on the phone about the situation with his counterpart in Brazil, the country that's taken in millions of Venezuelan refugees. Pompeo and Brazil's foreign minister agreed to stand by Juan Guaido and the democratically elected National Assembly, even as they struggle against the Maduro regime. Shouts in the streets of Caracas last night as security forces loyal to Nicolas Maduro surround the vehicle of the congressional vice president, 63-year-old Edgar Zambrano, one of Maduro's strongest critics. After refusing to get out of his car, security agents towed his vehicle, with the lawmaker still inside. Zambrano tweeted in Spanish minutes after he was being hauled away, "We Democrats will keep fighting." It was the first high-ranking arrest after the opposition's fizzled uprising on April 30th. It was led by Juan Guaido, who is leading the effort to end what he calls Maduro's dictatorship. He calls Zambrano's detention a kidnapping. At least 10 other opposition lawmakers have been stripped of their immunity. This week, Vice President Mike Pence said the U.S. will support opposition lawmakers under fire and anyone who defects from Maduro's government.
Just as the National Assembly has promised to provide amnesty to anyone who has not committed a war crime, so too the United States of America will consider sanctions relief for all those who step forward, stand up for the Constitution, and support the rule of law.
Today, Nicolas Maduro hit back, saying Pence's announcement was an assault on the honor and dignity of Venezuela's armed forces. A Venezuelan bishop said Sunday prominent figures in the government have asked for asylum from the church in case the regime should fall. Bishop Mario de Valle Moronta Rodriguez said, quote, "Of course, the church is open to protecting all those who are attacked, those who require some assistance. On the other hand, the church is not going to be their lackey. It is not hiding for the sake of hiding, but to protect."
According to our news partners at Catholic News Agency, the bishop said he and other bishops sent a report to Pope Francis about last week's uprising. They also told the Holy Father about the suffering of Venezuelans. The country has suffered economic turmoil, and as a result, people don't have enough food and medicine. Maduro has refused to allow humanitarian aid from the U.S. into the country. Lauren?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reporting from the State Department. Thank you, Wyatt. Church officials in Sri Lanka say they are close to reopening churches and schools closed since the deadly terror attacks on Easter Sunday. Cardinal Malcolm Ranjith says priests will decide whether to hold services this weekend depending on security. Catholic schools likely will open next week. The Easter Sunday bombings targeted churches and hotels. They killed more than 250 people. The faithful celebrated Sunday Mass at home the past 2 weekends over fears of another strike by radical Islamists. Canada holds its 22nd annual March for Life. Pro-life supporters took to the streets of Ottawa after listening to speakers, including former Planned Parenthood employee Abby Johnson.
There's freedom in the name of Jesus.
It is the largest annual protest. It happens on the city's Parliament Hill. This year marks the 50th anniversary of abortion as it's decriminalized in Canada. Coming up, analysis of the Vatican's new laws on reporting clergy sex abuse.
Soffro. Oggi ho letto qualcosa brutta e soffro.
Pope Francis says he is suffering along with two nomad groups in Rome. The Holy Father met with hundreds of members of the Roma and Sinti communities to show his support. Yesterday, protesters demonstrated against Rome's mayor after she provided public housing for a Roma family. Pope Francis has responded to the global clergy sex abuse crisis by issuing a new law. We told you about that earlier in the broadcast. It holds the Catholic hierarchy accountable for failing to protect their flocks. The decree requires the world's 415,000 Catholic priests and 660,000 nuns to report abuse and cover-ups. Now, the Vatican says people must know that the bishops are at the service of the people and not above the law, saying if they do wrong, they must be reported. And the Vatican could well see an avalanche of abuse and cover-up reports. The decree can be applied retroactively, meaning priests and nuns are now required to report even old cases of sexual wrongdoing and cover-up. They will enjoy whistleblower protection for doing so. This new law requires dioceses around the world to have a way to receive the claims confidentially. Joining me now is our resident canon lawyer, Edward Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency. Thank you so much, Edward. Welcome back to our broadcast.
Good to be here.
Explain this new law.
Well, it's a lot to explain in a short space of time, but basically what this does is this provides the framework that the Pope promised in February. He had, as you know, that global sexual abuse summit with the leaders of all the world's bishops' conferences, after which he said, what we need to see come out of this is a framework that can be applied all over the world, and that's what we've got.
And that seems to me it happened pretty quickly, February to May, for the Vatican, on Vatican standard?
I think by Vatican standards, this is breakneck speed. It's very, very impressive. I don't think anyone was expecting it to come out this soon, this fast.
Isn't something like this already in place?
Well, it's important to understand that, canon law has always had mechanisms for making allegations against anyone in the church if they've committed a crime, whether it's a priest or a bishop. Now, what this does is provide a lot more detail on how those accusations can be presented and how they should be handled. So before you get to the part where you're actually putting on a trial or anything, how do you begin to look into an accusation in the early stages? That's what this really colors in.
How is it going to be enforced, though? So anybody right now, any priest, any nun who saw a cover-up in the past, who has seen abuse in the past, now comes through confidentially and says, he did this or she did this, right? Then what?
Well, so looking at retroactivity is going to be an interesting thing, and we'll see how the Vatican chooses to apply that. That'll probably go case by case and dicastery by dicastery of the Roman Curia. But in terms of looking at new cases and people who have allegations that haven't yet been made, what we're seeing here is a clear call from the Pope saying every bishop's conference, every nation, every diocese has got to have a clear, public, accessible, and stable way of making an accusation. And that's room for the bishops to work in their own diocese.
What I don't understand is, what about interacting with police and criminal? I mean, these laws are Vatican laws.
Absolutely.
So is there anything in this that addresses the criminal aspect of it?
Well, cooperation with civil authorities on matter of sexual abuse is already something that there is in canon law. I mean, there is a presumption and in many cases an explicit provision in the church's law that says you have to report civilly as well. I think the only real place there's a departure between church law and civil law in terms of mandatory reporting and treating sexual abuse allegations very seriously is when you start talking about the confessional.
Have you heard, and there is a law being proposed in California to do away with that privacy, but
yeah.
We digress. This also includes a way for, quote, qualified lay experts to help. What will those qualifications be? How will they help?
Well, so this is one of the areas that they've carved out for local local Episcopal conferences to deal with, is to say they can put forward lists of people that they think are qualified, but in the end, if there's an investigation into a bishop, it's up to the investigating bishop to determine. These could be canon lawyers, these could be police officers, they could be people from the psychiatric profession. That's really left for them to assess what's best
on
for
the
the
local
case.
level.
And what's case by case.
We cannot forget about the victims in all of this. Have you spoken to anyone? I know this just came out. Do you think this is going to help in any way victims heal?
Absolutely, I think so. One of the things that this does contain is a clear legal provision that there is an obligation on the local church to provide medical support, counseling, therapy for victims. That it's not a question of simply assess the criminal effects and punish the offender and that's it, but to say there's a pastoral obligation to the victims of sexual abuse. And I think that's something that's really good to see.
Edward Condon, thank you for breaking this down for us, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Catholic News Agency. We appreciate you joining us. Lawmakers in Arizona pass a resolution declaring pornography a public health crisis. The measure does not ban adult material, nor has any effect on the law, but rather makes a public statement against the dangers it has to mental and physical health. The vote mostly ran along party lines, with Republicans in favor of the bill. Democrats were opposed. A Bible once carried by a World War II prisoner of war is the center of a legal fight at the Veterans Medical Center in New Hampshire. The Bible is part of a display at the entrance of the Manchester Veterans Administration Medical Center. A federal lawsuit filed by a U.S. Air Force veteran argues the Bible should be removed because it violates the First Amendment by appearing to favor one religion over another. Now, the letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs says the display does not violate the First Amendment. Up next, meet the professional football player who loves the Latin Mass and the sights and sounds of a Washington, D.C. Catholic concert in Rome. On Sundays in the fall, Harrison Butker plays for the Kansas City Chiefs. On Sundays in the off-season, he does a different kind of work. EWTN contributor Colm Flynn tells us about faith, football, and a kicker who made a very successful conversion.
Harrison Butker is a kicker for the Kansas City Chiefs. A star player, he is to many living the dream. But growing up, Harrison wasn't always happy in himself.
I don't know, you just play up a different person for different crowds, I guess. It's like certain Harrison for the football team, certain Harrison for the cameras, certain Harrison for your parents and families, certain guy for the weekends. You know, it's just like you're almost this fragmented person. I was just going through the motions. It was this emptiness. You know, I liked football, but there was nothing I was really like passionate about.
On his college football team was a man called Grant, who was a strong Catholic, and he encouraged Harrison to go back to his faith.
The biggest leap of faith for me was finally going to the sacrament of confession. And then that really was like what changed me. When I left that confessional, the way I felt, that was really what made me feel different than what I'd been feeling before. I felt like I don't know, I felt like me. I felt like I was authentically Harrison, you know, in every area of my life.
Now, after training, Harrison changes, but not into what you'd expect. He puts on a cassock and serves at Latin Mass every week.
It's opened my eyes to the tradition of the faith, you know, with St. Augustine, with Thomas Aquinas, with all of these great saints, and then seeing that this Mass of the Roman Rite, the Latin Mass, has been the Mass for the past 1,500 years that all these great saints went to. They were saying the same Latin prayers. It's just very beautiful. You know, I feel very united.
Father Sean Tunick is the associate pastor at the parish St. Michael the Archangel in Leawood, which is close by. He celebrates a Latin Mass every Monday evening evening. And recently, he and Harrison organised a solemn high mass, the most extravagant form of Latin mass that can be offered.
This just shows me that, especially our young people, they want something more than just the typical. They want something that is noble and beautiful, and particularly when our society is so up in the air about what's a solid foundation. Morals are changing. Our ideas of theology, philosophy are changing. This is the worship of God that lasted all the crises, the ups and downs of history for 1,500 years. That's something worthy.
Final big question, of course. You were just one win away from it last season, but this season, Super Bowl?
I think so, definitely.
Are you praying for it?
I'm not praying about that, no.
Why not? You should be praying for it.
I don't know. I pray for myself to be a good husband and father, I guess. That's number one.
Harrison, it was great meeting you, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Colm. Appreciate it.
In Kansas City, I'm Colm Flynn for EWTN News Nightly.
Our thanks to Colm for that piece. One note, the Grant he mentioned in this story who helped Butker convert is Grant Asen. He graduated from Georgia Tech. He turned down his final year of football eligibility and now is in the seminary in Louisiana. Finally, tonight, this year marks the 35th anniversary of diplomatic relations between the United States and the Vatican. To celebrate, the choir of the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception here in Washington, D.C., performed last night in the Eternal City. Our Rome Bureau Chief Alan Holdren reports.
Angelic voices filled the Basilica of Santa Maria sopra Minerva in a concert honoring U.S.-Vatican relations established in 1984. During rehearsal earlier this week, choir director Peter Latona told us it's a professional and personal honor.
The connection between the United States government and the Vatican, for me personally, I see that as an opportunity for good, for what's important for and the values of my Catholic faith. If that can be connected to the world of government and politics, I think that's a good thing.
Soprano Sarah McKimmey of Washington, D.C. converted to Catholicism after joining the choir.
I feel like what we really do is set an example for what choral singing could be like in the church. I'm a new Catholic too, so for me it's just an incredible thing to get to create music at this level.
The singers have a packed tour singing at masses throughout the Eternal City this week, but the highlight is performing for U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See and former choir member Callista Gingrich. She recognized the group's musical talent.
Its gifted professional singers lift our hearts and strengthen our faith. Throughout its illustrious history, the choir has performed for numerous dignitaries and heads of state, including Pope Benedict and Pope Francis.
The choir performed sacred hymns, some dating back to the 15th century, in the Roman Basilica, where the remains of St. Catherine of Siena are preserved, a treat for all listening to their celestial melodies. In Rome, Alan Holdren, EWTN News Nightly.
And Ambassador Callista Gingrich knows because she was an alto in the Basilica's choir for 20 years. The U.S. Embassy to the Holy See says it will be hosting more cultural events in Rome throughout the year to mark the anniversary. That does it for all of us here at EWTN News Nightly. To all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night, and God bless you.